Hello and welcome to the GeoCurrents series on understanding global demography. Today's lecture is on Malthus, Malthusianism, and Neo-Malthusianism, as well as the response provided by Ester Boserup. So let's start with Thomas Malthus and his influential theory, generally known as Malthusianism. And I would note is often regarded as one of the most influential and controversial theories in history. The Malthusian growth model is really quite simple. You could see it graphed there in the bottom left. Malthus's most important idea was that human population is going to tend to increase in an exponential manner, whereas food production is going to increase much more slowly, or as he put it, food production increases arithmetically, in a practice of addition, one might say, whereas population will increase geometrically, squaring, in other words. Malthus's first work on this, an essay on the principle of population, appeared in 1798 and was followed by 5 other editions, which really substantially enlarged the argument. The second edition was much longer than the first. And the final one didn't appear till 1826. Malthusianism itself, Malthus's ideas, were rooted in debates about human progress during the 18th century Enlightenment, as it's often called. A couple of quotes I have here, one from Gilles Lepore. The idea of progress, the notion that human history is the history of human betterment, dominated the worldview of the West between the Enlightenment and the First World War. Or the other one from J.B. Bury says, at least according to Bury anyway, the idea of progress becomes fully developed in the Enlightenment through the works of thinkers like Francis Bacon, Voltaire, Turgot, and Condorcet. The point I want to make here is that the idea of progress is not long-standing. Well, there occasionally people certainly wrote about progress and development, but the dominant view was one of cyclicality or even of decline, or declensionism, it's sometimes called. So if you look at writers before the Enlightenment, it was very common to believe that human betterment would occur and then regression would occur after that. And there was a long-standing set of ideas that human society had declined from a golden age, or we could even think of it as in the Judeo-Christian narrative of descent from the Garden of Eden. There are many ways of looking at this. In the 17th century in France, which was the 17th century often is considered the dawn of modern science, we've had scientific giants like Galileo and Newton really developing far more powerful ideas of understanding the natural world than anything that had come before. But it's interesting, even at this late date, there was a major quarrel, particularly in France, often framed as a quarrel between the ancients and the moderns. In other words, who had superior understanding of the world and human society. The ancients, meaning essentially ancient Greek and to a lesser extent Latin Roman thinkers, versus the moderns. So it wasn't really until the 18th century, the 1700s, during the period that's often referred to as the Enlightenment, that the moderns were almost universally agreed as being ahead of the ancients. And by the end of the century in France, ideas about the perfectibility of human society were becoming widespread. So Condorcet is well associated with this. I believe that expanding knowledge, which was occurring rapidly, the expansion of knowledge, would create an ever more just world of individual freedom, material affluence, moral compassion. Condorcet stressed equal rights for all, free markets, public education, constitutional government. These are signposts of Enlightenment thinking. And envisaged humanity as continually progressing towards a utopian society, never perhaps quite reaching it, but on that pathway nonetheless. Similar ideas were being expressed in Britain, especially by William Godwin in his very influential essay, Inquiry Concerning Political Justice. So Godwin thought, like Condorcet, that humanity is moving towards perfection. He believed, however, he was more of a radical in many ways, and he believed that existing social and political institutions, which he regarded as unduly conservative, were holding us back on this progressive movement. Given his radical ideas, he was very skeptical of private property, of businesses working together to form monopolies. He was very critical of monarchy and even marriage, which was rather scandalous in those days. And he also believed, as a radical Enlightenment thinker, that if reason is going to be consistently applied, government is not necessary. That reason endows humanity with the ability to advance towards perfection. Godwin was a very controversial figure. A lot of his, some of these controversies were related to his marriage to Mary Wollstonecraft. It's interesting, neither one of them really believed in marriage, but when Mary Wollstonecraft became pregnant, or maybe it was before, I'm not exactly sure, but they did decide to marry each other because of the social opposition to it. Mary Wollstonecraft, often considered the first, or at least one of the first feminist writers. Her work, The Vindication of the Rights of Women, was very well known and very controversial. Also to note that I think it was 11 days after Mary Wollstonecraft gave birth to their daughter, also named Mary, that the mother died, as was very common in those days. And the daughter went on to become Mary Shelley. She married one of her father's followers or admirers, the poet Percy Shelley, and gained fame in writing the book Frankenstein, or the Modern Prometheus. So a very interesting and important family. At any rate, back to Malthus. He was not at all impressed with Godwin's arguments, although it's very interesting. The first line of his essay notes how important it was. The following essay owes its origin to a conversation with a friend on the subject of Mr. Godwin's essay on avarice and profusion. And if you read the first edition of Malthus's work, it's interesting to see that he has some very nice things to say about Godwin, and then proceeds to try to demolish his argument in every way. Same with Condorcet. Anyway, just to quote a few of these, I have read some of the speculations on the perfectibility of man and society with great pleasure, and I've been, it should be warmed and delighted with the enchanting picture with which they hold forth. I ardently wish for such happy improvements, but I see, and to my great understanding, unconquerable difficulties in the way to them. And then he makes several postulates, and the basic argument being that population growth is going to overwhelm food production and return humanity to a condition of misery, regardless of any improvements that are made. Interesting, the population of England was not increasing exponentially when Malthus published his first edition, although it soon would be. That comes a little bit later. So I've put a red line there approximating 1798 when the first edition was published, and you could see that the population of England had been increasing, but not at a particularly rapid rate, although after the Industrial Revolution that really changes. So one might wonder where Malthus got this idea of exponential population increase. Well, he got it, probably from a variety of sources, but one was from Benjamin Franklin, because a few decades earlier, Franklin identified exponential population growth in North America, that the colonial population was doubling roughly every 25 years. Now, some of this was from immigration, but mostly it was from natural increase. Because the indigenous societies in North America had been vastly reduced in population, and population was not nearly as large as that of Europe to begin with. But this huge reduction in the human population meant that there were ample resources, new lands, lots of fertile soil. And in a situation like this, human society can grow very rapidly. You might have a total birth rate of a total fertility rate of maybe 8 children per woman. It's often thought that was the situation around 1800 in the United States, and a little fewer than half of those children would die before reaching maturity, but that would still lead the average couple to produce 4 living children, and that will lead to exponential increase. Malthus's conclusion was that humanity was basically doomed to an oscillation between plenty and misery. It's a cyclical argument. And to quote the essay on the principle of population, first edition, during this period of distress, the discouragement to marriage, and the difficulty of rearing a family are so great that the population is at a standstill. In the meantime, the cheapness of labor, the plenty of laborers, and the necessity of increasing industry among them encourage cultivators to employ more labor upon their land, to turn up fresh soil, to manure and improve more completely what is already in tillage, till ultimately the means of subsistence become in the same proportion to the population as to the period from which we set out. The situation of laborers being then again tolerably comfortable, the restraints to population are in some degree loosened, and the same retrograde and progressive movement with respect to happiness are retarded. So in other words, population is unleashed when things turn to the better, and then the increase in population undermines everything. In the first edition, Malthus had very little recognition that well-off people would ever voluntarily limit their fertility. And as we have seen in past lectures, that certainly happened in ancient Rome. It was currently true in France. And to the extent that Malthus did recognize this fact, he thought it was due to appalling practices of vice. That's one of the issues one has with reading Malthus, is that he often doesn't actually come right out and say what he's talking about. So he'll say, for example, here we have on page 41, in short, it is difficult to conceive any check to population which does not come under the description of some species of misery or vice. Now, what he means by vice are things like various forms of voluntary birth control, certainly abortion, and most certainly infanticide. So vice was sort of voluntarily limiting the population was something he did not, at least in this first edition, approve of. He also did not see the Industrial Revolution, which was occurring at the time, and he was aware of it, as offering any salvation to the United Kingdom. He thought that any wealth produced by industrial growth would be undermined by population growth. No surprise. And to some extent, even that, one could argue that did happen. Wages for workers in Britain did not really increase until the 20th century, or increased just a little bit. Tremendous profits were being made as the Industrial Revolution proceeded, but it wasn't really felt by the laboring class. And there are a variety of reasons for that. Certainly, those on the left would mostly attribute it to the avarice of the industrialists, but the fact that the population was in Britain was increasing at an essentially exponential rate by this time helped keep down the wages. He also thought that industrialization and the accompanying urbanization generated their own forms of misery. I have some quotes of that effect later on, which would then check or reduce population growth. He was not in favor of importing food. This was much of the period when he was active was when Britain was under the Corn Laws, which pretty much prohibited the importation of grain. He did not want big imports of food because he thought that would undermine domestic agriculture and then threaten food security. And then just a quote from page 38, noted that additional checks on population, besides famine and general lack of food, would include great cities, talking here about the Industrial Revolution, unwholesome manufactures, again, this is something that was growing, luxury, pestilence, and war. Also important to note that Malthus hated the British poor laws and relief system despite its official severity. So ever since the early 1600s, England had run what's known as, had provided food assistance, generally run through church parishes. So people were paying tithes to support this. But the Poor Relief Act made provisions that the people who can't work were to be cared for in an almshouse or poorhouse run by parishes, and that would offer relief to people who are unable to work. Able-bodied people were supposed to be put to work in a house of industry, basically run through parishes, and materials were to be provided for them to be set to work, and then idle or vagrants were to be sent to house of correction or even prison. But despite the severity, of the official act, it didn't really work that way, because parishes often found that it was much cheaper simply to provide what was known as outdoor relief, distributing money, food, and even clothing to impoverished people, rather than building these workhouses, which were expensive. And there were big debates over what were deserving versus the undeserving poor. To quote the Wikipedia article on this, overseers of the poor would know their paupers and be able to differentiate the deserving and undeserving. The old poor laws operated at a time when the population was small enough for everyone to know everyone else. Well, not exactly. And so people's circumstances would be known, and the idle poor would be unable to claim on the parish poor rates. In other words, be unable to get this relief. Of course, it's debatable to what extent this happened. And of course, as population was growing, this kind of intimate community was declining. But back to Malthus, the most important thing here is he really believed, especially in the first edition, that the more help poor receive, the more they reproduce, and that's just going to generate more misery. So to quote again, page 31, to remedy the frequent distress of the common people, the poor laws of England have been instituted, but it is to be feared that that though they may have alleviated a little of the intensity of individual misfortune, they have spread the general evil over a much larger surface. It is a subject often stated in conversation and mentioned always as a matter of great surprise that, notwithstanding the immense sum that is collected annually for the poor in England, there is still so much distress among them. In other words, we provide food and money to the poor, and what do we know? We just get more poor people, so this isn't working, or so he argued. And finally, page 33, it may at first appear strange, but I believe it true, that I cannot by means of money raise a poor man and enable him to live much better than he did before, without proportionally distressing others in the same class. They're going to be distressed because the poor who have been provided food will have more children and undermine everything. One still sees very similar arguments being made. It's often been said that Charles Dickens' character of Ebenezer Scrooge in The Christmas Carol, very well-known character, was based on Malthus. So the Wikipedia article notes Ebenezer Scrooge represents the perceived ideas of Malthus, famously illustrated by his explanation as to why he, Scrooge, why he refuses to donate to the poor and destitute. Quote, if they would rather die, they had better do it and decrease the surplus population. So pretty straightforward Malthusianism. And in the year Malthus died, 1834, the Whig Party, which is the party of basically the industrial and mercantile classes in England, as opposed to the Tories, who were the party of the land-owning aristocracy and gentry. But anyway, the Whigs despised what they considered Tory paternalism, and they overturned the poor laws of Britain and ended outdoor relief. Now, they got a lot of Tory support, too, I should mention, in this bill. So the act has been described as the classic example of a fundamental Whig Benthamite reforming legislation of the period. Its theoretical basis was Thomas Malthus's principle that population increased faster than resources unless unchecked, the iron law of wages, and Jeremy Bentham's doctrine that people would do what was pleasant and would tend to claim relief rather than be engaged in work. So Bentham was the philosophical radical, as he's often called, associated with the development of the theory of utilitarianism, which is the greater good for the greater number. So it certainly had its ethical or moral aspects, but it was also extremely harsh and really believed that the predominant motivating impulse for human beings was to seek pleasure and avoid pain. But anyway, after 1834, relief to the poor in England was only in harsh workhouses, and harsh indeed they were. The figure on the upper left, you can see the crowded sleeping quarters. You can see people in work conditions. These are sometimes regarded as essentially prisons or almost slave labor. Malthus was also had opinions on the Irish potato famine, which I talked about in a previous lecture, when Ireland reached a situation where population had grown. Population was most of the peasants were extremely impoverished. They had to pay large rents to their landlords, many of whom were living in England. And a blight came and hit the potato crop, which was the sustenance for most Irish peasants, even while Ireland continued to export food to England at this time. But I have a little snippet from an article here, how the Irish potato famine, how belief in overpopulation leads to human evil. Well, you can certainly describe it at that. And to quote from another book here, according to Malthusian doctrine, any increase in the Irish population would be due to their carnal and vicious nature. Famine would control this population explosion, and in Malthusian terms, this is what they deserved. There was a tremendous amount of prejudice, often framed in quite openly racial terms, prejudice against the Irish. And Malthus did, in his letters, more than his published works, did opine on this matter. And he diagnosed the problem as one of overpopulation and consequence of inexpensive food, meaning the potato. So to quote Malthus here, the cheapness of this nourishing root, potatoes, joined to the ignorance and barbarism of the Irish people, have encouraged marriage to such a degree that the population is pushed much beyond the industry and present resources of the country. And he also says the land in Ireland is infinitely more people than in England. I should note, simply untrue. And to give full effect to the natural resources of the country, a great part of the population should be swept from the soil. So you can see the Reverend Malthus, and he was a minister, was extraordinarily harsh in his views. Although he did moderate his ideas over the course of 6 editions. He was deeply devoted to this project and really devoted much of his life to it. And over the course of these new editions, he had greater emphasis on preventive checks to population growth, but what he liked to focus on is moral restraint, not getting married, not having sexual relations. And he did have some acknowledgement that social and economic improvement could mitigate the misery of overpopulation. And he no longer called for the complete abolition of the poor laws, which did indeed happen, and increases acknowledgement that there can be gains in agricultural productivity. Most important is he added more empirical evidence. The first volume is very sparse on data. Malthus was influential in many ways, and one way, a little aside here, was his ideas significantly influenced Charles Darwin and Alfred Russel Wallace, who together came up with the theory of natural selection as the driver of biological evolution. Alfred Russel Wallace doesn't get much credit, but Charles Darwin was sitting on his theory, afraid to publish it, and then he got a letter from the naturalist Wallace basically outlining exactly the same theory, and that was what led Darwin to publish. But somehow Darwin gets all the credit. But anyway, just a little story here from the piece of the slide on the left. After being mobbed in their carriage by poor starving people, Charles and Erasmus Darwin, Erasmus was his grandfather, and actually had come up with a theory of evolution, but without the mechanism of natural selection. But anyway, supposedly after this experience, grandfather and grandson were prompted to consider the human struggle for existence. They were discussing Malthus's assertion that population would skyrocket if not for natural control such as famine and disease. And then Charles Darwin had this new insight: other animals' populations must also be kept low by a struggle for existence in which only the best adapted survive. And very similar with Alfred Russel Wallace. Now, Malthus had plenty of enemies. On the far left, certainly the Marx and the Marxists despised Malthusianism. To quote here from an article by Richard Wilgan, probably no one was more excoriated by Marx than Malthus. His tendency to label Malthus as a plagiarist, sycophant, reverend scribbler, and his population principle as a libel on the human race have all been well documented. And so this was a long-standing view in far-left Marxian scholarship. And we can trace it all the way up to China's Mao Zedong, who famously said that every mouth comes with two hands, meaning that, okay, the population of China is exploding, which was happening when Mao was in power, but he said this just means there's so much more labor, and that all these new people are going to be able to basically conquer nature, might be one way of looking at it, and ensure a glorious future. And during the 1960s, the population growth rate in China was 2.4% a year. So this is really sort of a population explosion. Interesting, very quickly after Mao Zedong died, these ideas were overturned. Deng Xiaoping took power in 1978, and he saw China's rapid population growth as a block to economic development, and not long afterwards came China's famous one-child policy. It wasn't just Marxists or those on the far left who were very critical. I'm not going to spend much time on this slide, but John Stuart Mill, who was the most prominent liberal thinker in 19th century Britain, a famous book on liberty. But anyway, Mill acknowledged some of Malthus's ideas, but he criticized his conclusion that poverty was unavoidable, because Mill, like other liberals, believed in the potential for social improvement, particularly through education, birth control, and women's rights. So this birth control was not something that Malthus was willing to countenance, but liberals like John Stuart Mill certainly were, and thought that could really change the dynamics, as was indeed the case. At any rate, by the late 19th and early 20th centuries, there's a real decline in Malthusian thinking. There's a sharp drop in European fertility rates, which I've talked about before, which is not something that Malthus had foreseen. There's also continuing increases in agricultural yields. That's particularly true after the Haber process for fixing nitrogen, one of the most important food plant nutrients, was developed in 1909, greatly increasing food production, and also the growth in the global food trade. Europe was no longer dependent on its own resources by any means. Food coming in from steppes of Ukraine, what is now Ukraine, from North America, US and Canada, from Argentina and other places. So it just didn't seem to be such an issue. But it becomes an issue again in the 20th century. One major factor here is that global population starts to surge. And you could see here on the graph here, the red line is the annual growth rate of the world's population. And I put it in a blue line for around 1920, and you could see a real inflection point, because modern medical developments are coming to even poorer parts of the world. And their birth rates are going up as well, and the global population is now really surging. Although it's really not till after World War II that you get what is known as the growth of Neo-Malthusianism, which is part and parcel of the development of modern environmentalism. So with Neo-Malthusianism, some differences with standard Malthusianism. One would be an emphasis on what is often called third world population growth, or growth outside of the wealthy industrial countries. Neo-Malthusians have a strong emphasis on contraception, sterilization, and abortion as preventive checks, something that Malthus was not willing to support. Also, much more of an emphasis on state policy to encourage contraception and to reduce fertility. Maybe even more important is an emphasis not just on food, but on all kinds of resources, and a belief that resources are being exhausted by continual economic growth, which then threatens to undermine the entire economic foundation. Also emphasizing deforestation, soil erosion, extinction of other species. Malthus certainly was aware of things like soil erosion. He was not concerned with extinction of other species. So we're moving into modern environmentalism by this time, whereas human beings are not the only issue of concern, other species as well. And shortly after the end of World War II, 1948, two books were published in the United States that popularized what we might call Neo-Malthusian environmentalism. One was William Vogt's Road to Survival, and the other is Fairfield Osborne's Our Plundered Planets. These are books that are considered by environmentalists as really some of the first strong modern environmentalist statements, and really sort of set the tone for environmentalism. They didn't have they had an impact, but not a huge impact when published. Conservatives thought that they were much too radical, and liberals often thought they were much too pessimistic. So neither major sides of the political spectrum were really particularly open to this interpretation. But that changes in the late 1960s. Of course, everything changes in the late 1960s with a sort of a wholesale cultural revolution. But it's also interesting to note that 1968 is the year when the annual growth rate of the world population peaks at about 2.1% and then declines pretty rapidly after that. Now, of course, there's a huge lag factor, and birth rates remain above replacement level in most of the world, well above it, and population continues to grow. But this ever increase in the growth rate, that comes to an end. Although, of course, people were not aware of that at the time. At the time, it looked like it's just going up and up and up, and where is it going to stop? There were a number of important books and articles published at this time, but I'll mention two key 1968, what we might call Neo-Malthusian publications. One more from the left, that would be Paul and Ann Ehrlich's The Population Bomb, and the other Garrett Hardin's more right-wing viewpoint, The Tragedy of the Commons. So what the Ehrlichs argued was, again, a Malthusian view that the population is going to it's growing at such a rapid rate, it is going to overwhelm first food supply, but also supply of other resources. And as you can see on the cover here, while you're reading these words, 4 people will have died from starvation, most of them children. And they also, Ehrlichs argued that the battle to feed humanity is over. There are going to be massive famines by the 1970s and 80s, which are going to basically undermine global economic growth. Garrett Hardin was also a Neo-Malthusianism, but had a different take on it. His very well known and widely cited article on the tragedy of the commons believed that the root problem is lack of private ownership. He said whenever you have common resources, it could have been village commons in the Middle Ages, or even after that, or the commons of the ocean, of ocean fisheries, where any country can send out its fishing fleets. Anyway, he argued that in a situation like this, the individual's interest is to get the most they can out of the system, but that's just going to undermine the system by overexploiting it, taking out too many resources. So he said we really need to have a new kind of ethics, and he called it lifeboat ethics. The idea is on a lifeboat, you might not be able to keep everybody alive, and maybe some people have to be kicked off the lifeboat. That would be one of the most harsh ways of looking at it. But we cannot have these sort of common resources. We have to have much firmer control over it. Ehrlich's ideas are still widely cited and used. Hardin's are not. Well, one reason is that Elinor Ostrom, economist, really refuted the tragedy of the commons by actually looking at how common lands and common resources have been, in many cases, wisely managed through collective behavior. It doesn't necessarily happen or always happen. I have here on this slide 8 principles for managing commons, but she showed how very often this does happen. And so this strain of Neo-Malthusianism has pretty much disappeared. And note that Elinor Ostrom received a Nobel Prize in Economics for this work. Back to Ehrlich, though. Paul and Ann, very alarmist tone in this book and in subsequent publications as well. Yeah, so here I was quoting this already, but the first edition had the battle to feed humanity is over. By the 1970s, hundreds of millions will starve to death in spite of any crash programs embarked on now. At this late date, nothing can prevent a substantial increase in the world death rate. We thought by 1985 enough people will have died to reduce the population to some acceptable level, like 1.5 billion. And it wasn't just people. He also argued that too many cars, too many factories, too much detergent, too much pesticides, multiplying contrails, inadequate sewage treatment plants, too little water, too much carbon dioxide. All these are problems that all can be traced easily to too many people. Well, of course, there are many reasons for those, and it is important to note that most of those issues have seen significant improvement since 1968, despite increasing population. Ehrlich basically remains firm in his beliefs. He has changed some of his views, but not too much. A couple of quotes here. Actually, the problem in the world is there are too many rich people. So initially it was just focused on too many people, but because wealthier people consume more resources, he's focused more on that. And then he also argued that the book The Population Bomb was overly optimistic. I was writing about climate change. Anne and I actually, when they wrote the book, we discussed whether or not you could take a gondola to the Empire State Building and that sort of thing. But we didn't know at the time whether the climate change would be in the direction of heating or cooling. We just didn't know enough about it. I have to say, I remember this very well. I was an environmental studies student at the University of California at Santa Cruz in the 1970s. And at that time, I was taught by my professors that the world was in an uneasy balance. Pollution was resulting in much more sulfur dioxide in the upper levels of the atmosphere, which blocked out sunlight and resulted in global cooling. But carbon dioxide was trapping warmth and resulting in global warming. So there was this uneasy balance, and eventually one of them would sort of come to the fore. And because conventional pollution, sulfur dioxide, much more easily controlled than carbon dioxide, we had a big reduction in these gases that resulted in cooling and a continued increase in gases resulting in warming. And so, as Ehrlich is sort of hinting at here, is global climate change, warming, that would become the big threatening issue, which he hadn't realized at the time. A few years later, 1972, another very important book was published called Limits to Growth. And in this case, the limits, that's very much a Malthusian interpretation, but the limits to growth were justified by computer simulations, which were quite new at this time. So the authors had this World 3 model, and they looked at things like natural resources and food and population and pollution and analyzing them together and concluding that food per capita and industrial output would plummet sometimes around the year 2020. So we could see population there peaking and then declining. Pollution's peaking and declining as population does. You could see food per capita just really plummeting along with resources. So it's a very pessimistic view of the future. And it's really based very much on Malthusian ideas. So it's based on 5 variables: population, food, industrialization, pollution, and consumption of non-renewable natural resources. At the time of the study, all these variables were increasing and were assumed to continue to grow exponentially, while the ability of technology to increase resources would grow in a linear fashion. I mean, that is straightforward Malthusian thinking. Malthus applied it to population, and now the authors to Limits to Growth are applying it across the board. A lot of opposition, no surprise to this, particularly from economists. And the sort of anti-Neo-Malthusianism, its most well-noted author was probably Julian Simon, an economist who died in 1998. But Simon wrote a book called The Ultimate Resource, and the ultimate resource to Simon was human beings. So he argued that their dire predictions have failed, that technology and human ingenuity can solve all resource limitations. This is sometimes called cornucopianism, that if we apply enough money and talent into scientific resources, we'll be able to solve all these problems and come up with new resources or new ways of obtaining them. And argued that since human beings are the ultimate resource, the more people, the better, essentially. So there are long-term benefits, because the more people you have, the more thinking you have, and thinking will solve all of our problems. It's a famous wager between Julian Simon and Paul Ehrlich, over specifically over the price of chromium, copper, nickel, tin, and tungsten. Because Ehrlich was arguing that these would all become much more expensive because they're running out. Simon said, no, they'll become cheaper because we'll find new ways of mining them and producing them, and we'll find substitutes for them, and it's not an issue. So they had this wager in 1980. Simon challenged Ehrlich to put his money where his mouth was in response to Ehrlich's published claim, if I were a gambler, I would take even money that England will not even exist in the year 2000. So anyway, they had this bet on a 10-year bet, and it was one that Simon won. So the Neo-Malthusian response to the Simon and cornucopians, if you will, is that while some of our predictions have been accurate, and most of our predictions will be accurate in the long term, we just haven't waited long enough. And it is true that if the Simon-Ehrlich wager had been from 1980 to 2011 rather than 1980 to 1990, Ehrlich would have won on 4 of the 5 metals. Metals, like other commodities, they go up and down. There's a tremendous amount of fluctuation in their price depending on global demand and supply, of course, which means that you can have very different results on a wager like this depending on the time period. And also, the most important response from Neo-Malthusian is that global climate change is now revealed to be the ultimate problem. It's not being adequately addressed, and that will undermine future economic growth. Now, moving into the second topic here, I want to take on not Neo-Malthusianism, but rather standard Malthusianism, just looking at people, food, and population. And I want to outline here Ester Boserup's theory of agricultural intensification, which is often seen as one of the most important scholarly rejoinders to the Malthusian arguments about food and population. So, in contrast to Malthus, Boserup emphasized positive aspects of large population, although she certainly allowed for the negative aspects as well. It's much more balanced. And she did suggest that the more people there are, the more hands there are to work. That's rather simplistic, though. That's sort of what Mao Zedong said. Really, her thesis is much more nuanced. She did argue that necessity is the mother of all inventions, that population pressure forces people to adapt, and if they adapt properly, they can sustain larger populations. So her best-known book is The Conditions of Agricultural Growth. I think this was 1966. I'm sorry, I should have put in a date. Boserup herself is an agrarian economist from Denmark. Wikipedia notes that she's best known for this theory, positing that population change drives the intensity of agricultural production. Her position countered the Malthusian argument that that agricultural methods determine population via limits on food supply. But she responded with a theory that emphasizes a dynamic analysis embracing all types of agriculture. So just to very simplistically graph it, you could see population increasing, and then Malthus view that food supply is going to just slowly increase, and eventually there'll be this crisis point, Malthusian catastrophe, with Boserup arguing that you have these jumps in food production as people adapt to larger populations. And they do so through what is known as agricultural intensification. So again, this is a very complex and nuanced argument, and it's difficult to just reduce it here into a few bullet points. But that's what this slide does. That's not my slide. I found it, borrowed it from someone else. But you can see that she has this intensification stage. And this sort of classic Boserupian intensification posits that you have a wooded environment. It's different in a grassland, what's initially a grassland environment. But let's look at, say, for the example of European agriculture. Most of Europe was forested, and this is true in many other parts of the world. But anyway, in these what were originally forested environments, farmers would start with what is known as forest fallow, sometimes called slash and burn or swidden, which would involve cutting a small plot of woodland burning the wood. You burn the wood and the branches. That releases a lot of ash, which really fertilizes the soil. It eliminates insects and pests for a while. And you get a couple years of a year or so of very abundant harvest with very little labor. It's actually very easy to do this sort of thing. But then you have to abandon that plot because the fertility of the soil declines, pests and plant diseases multiply. But then you just move to a new spot of the forest and you do the same thing. And then maybe after 20 years or 40 years, whatever the population pressure is going to allow, you return to that initial spot. Forest would have regrown, fertility would have rebounded, and you can start over again. But as population grows, you have to decrease your fallow period. So to bush fallow 10 years, short fallow 2 years, then to annual cropping, then to cropping, multi-cropping, cropping several times a year if the climate will allow it. And so you get this propelled development of ever more intensive forms of agriculture. So there's still plenty of slash and burn or swidden cultivators today in forested areas of Southeast Asia, of many parts of Africa, many parts of the Amazonian basin. They're diminishing, to be sure, but they still exist. And it was formerly common in many parts of Europe, Finland in particular. Here's a photo from Finland in the 1920s. Finland, a very heavy forest coverage. And as I mentioned before, though, this is this sort of slash and burn. If you have especially a large forest with healthy big trees, and especially if you have metal tools, it was more difficult when there were stone tools, but with metal tools, it's pretty easy to chop down, or somebody simply girdle the trees so they die. And then burn and just scatter seeds. They're going to respond very quickly. But as population builds up, this becomes more and more untenable, so you move to these more intensive forms. And I'll just give you some examples of some very intensive forms of agriculture. In southern China, and particularly lowland environments of China, have long been characterized by double or even triple cropping, getting in 2 or sometimes 3 crops. In parts of southern China, you might get 2 rice crops and 1 barley crop or something from the same field. And so without fallow and these multiple cropping cycles in a year, you can get a lot of food out of the system. And terracing is part and parcel of the same sort of thing. So these are very intense agricultural systems. They involve intense amounts of labor because that's the other important part of this Boserupian scheme is the more you intensify, the more labor has to go into the system. Swidden is pretty easy. You slash, you burn, you scatter seeds. You often don't have to do much at all until you come back to harvest. But with this sort of double or triple cropping, you're sort of always working on the field, and you also have to maintain the fertility, which involves bringing in fertilizers of varying different sorts. And I have talked in other lectures about how precious human waste was in early modern Japan or China, simply to maintain the fertility of those fields. Perhaps the most intensive agricultural, pre-modern agricultural systems ever devised were the Chinampas of central Mexico, the basin of central Mexico where Mexico City is located today, heartland of what had been the Aztec Empire, or Triple Alliance as it's more formally called. But a very large lake in the middle of this basin. It's a little bit brackish, so they built dikes to keep the salt and the fresh water separated. But then in the freshwater areas, they built these agricultural systems called chinampas, which involve going into shallow water areas, driving in poles and even planting trees and putting in woven reed mats, scooping the muck, the very fertile lake bottom muck, out of the canals, and then putting it on top to become the new agricultural lands. There's something called floating islands, but they're not really floating. The diagram's a little bit misleading here. It might have been a little floating, but it's in that representation on the right, it's the right hand segment that's sort of the most accurate. But these fields don't require any irrigation because it's sort of water seeps in from the canals. That provides fertilization comes from basically, as I said before, scooping the muck out of the bottoms of the canals, which will fill up. But if you take it and put it into on top of the growing beds, you're going to have fertile land. I also had the great advantage of being able to move everything by boat, and it's always more efficient to move by boat than overland unless you have a modern road and vehicle system. So these systems produced a tremendous amount of food, which really was able to underwrite the very dense population of central Mexico, very large cities of the time, and so on. The agricultural system of the Mesoamericans was short on providing animal protein. The only real domesticated animal other than dogs were turkeys. So that it's often thought that they were short on protein. But the canals in this system provided quite a bit of protein. There's fish, there's frogs. Probably the most important was the axolotl, or the what's known as a neotenous tiger salamander. Neotenous means it retains its juvenile characteristics its entire life and breeds as a aquatic juvenile. But they could live in these thrived in these canals and the Chinampas system, and were very widely eaten and considered quite a delicacy. And it's interesting in Japan they're being brought back, and you can see some deep fried here. These animals are very important in scientific research. It's interesting. They're almost extinct in the wild, but they're very common in labs. They have the trait of being able to regenerate almost any part of their body. Cut off their legs and they're going to grow back. Anyway, we're almost done with the lecture here. I just want to give some sort of summaries here of the disadvantages of Boserupian intensification. So greatly increased work burdens of people as intensification proceeds. There's going to be poorer diets with much less animal protein in particular. There's going to be increased prevalence of pathogens. People are tightly packed together. You're going to have a lot of waterborne pathogens as well. Certainly people in societies, also we go back to traditional Japanese society, sort of a horror of eating raw or unpeeled vegetables, partly because they were historically quite dangerous because you used human waste to fertilize your fields, so you want to be very careful about that. Advantages, though, Boserup anyway argued that it really increases the work ethic. Now, that has disadvantages as well. It is nice to have some leisure, but a lot of different societies have been associated with high work ethic sort of societal viewpoints. Certainly, that's true of Chinese, Japanese, and others. And anyway, Boserup would argue this is largely because they were forced to work incredibly hard to survive because of their very dense population and hence very high degree of agricultural intensification. Europe certainly saw agricultural intensification itself, particularly after the agricultural revolution of the 18th century, but it was European agriculture was relatively unintensive compared to Asian standards, partly because population density was not as intensive. Also, there were some climatic limitations. Also, Europe was able to import more food from other parts of the world. But Boserup also argued that intensification resulted in increased opportunities for labor specialization, both in the agricultural economy and otherwise. Large population density allows this, and as Adam Smith noted long ago, labor specialization has advantages for economic growth. Although one could argue, though, that it's still an economic cul-de-sac that you can get through classical Boserupian intensification. You could have a very large population surviving and getting an adequate food from a very intensive agricultural system, but it's not going to generate modern economies where we have ever-increasing productivity and economic growth and prosperity. That came with the Industrial Revolution, not with any system of agricultural intensification. And finally, just a couple more slides, but I do want to note a kind of a Neo-Boserupian synthesis, what we might call it. I have here Earl Ellis, a geographer, University of Maryland, Baltimore campus. He's written a lot on Malthus, Boserup, and others. He also has here a scholar named Clifford Geertz, an anthropologist, who coined the term agricultural involution. He was looking at villages in the Indonesian island of Java, I believe in the 1960s, where again you had very intensive agricultural production, had very dense human populations, but without really any economic growth. They were kind of stuck in this high density environment. But what Ellis argued was that you can have this sort of well, if you can look at the graph here, so you can see population increasing. We've seen that graph over and over again. And then Boserup showing, yes, the population is engaging in agricultural intensification, but then it kind of reaches a limit, stalls out, and then he shows a possible Malthusian collapse. But then he has what he knows as regime shifts, where you come up with a new approach to agricultural production. I'll give you one example here would be the so-called Green Revolution that occurred after World War II in many parts of the world, where major international aid agencies, Rockefeller Foundation and so on, were funding research to develop new strains of crops, particularly corn, rice, and wheat, that would respond very well to increases in fertilizer. And if you take wheat, for example, there was a real problem with fertilization because if you fertilize too much, the wheat would tend to grow too tall and then would fall over. So they were able to breed dwarf strains where you add fertilizer and you're mostly adding grain rather than stock. And so that's a sort of a regime shift. So to go back to the slide here, intensification, increased population density drives resource demands and more productive technologies. Then you have involution, then you have collapse, although Ellis notes this is rarely observed, although it did sometimes. And then regime shifts in the technological or social systems of production. And I'm not saying that this is the right approach, but it does synthesize a lot of these issues. So, yes, I mentioned the Green Revolution, an example of regime shift. So you could see the population index, that's in gray in the bottom, and then you could see cereal yield index and cereal production increase, increasing faster than that, which was not anything Malthus would have foreseen. Now, of course, there are concerns that there are limits to the Green Revolution. The Green Revolution comes with problems of continuing to pour on more fertilizers and insecticides and various kinds of biocides. That creates huge environmental problems. There's problems with salinization of the soil and wells running dry and all kinds of problems. But it is also true that in the 1960s, India was, with a population of about 400 million, was hardly able to feed itself. Had more intense problems of famine and especially malnutrition than it does today with 1.3 billion. India is able to feed itself, and it's because of these agricultural developments with the so-called Green Revolution. Although I will point, Malthusians will say that this is a temporary solution and it's not the final solution. So, as always, I don't want to come down on one side or the other. And I'll note here in the last slide, yes, the debate continues. So, to illustrate this, I have an article from a few years back. Opinion, sadly, Malthus was right. What now? And another one, even more recent from Scientific America. Malthus is still wrong. Why Malthus makes for bad science policies. So, I don't expect this debate to end anytime soon. And I would encourage everyone to think and read about it and try to come up with their own informed views and opinions. So thank you. This is the end of the lecture, and I hope to post another one quite soon.